Okay, so we are on Sorella, and we're looking at the universal M25XP three-cylinder diesel engine. And we're going to talk through some of the systems, and we're going to start with the cooling system. So the first thing we are going to do is open the water valve and take the key off. And then we're going to look at the strainer, which is just above the through hull, and actually put the light through it to see that there's no seaweed or other stuff inside, and it looks nice and clear. That line then goes to the water pump, which is on the front of the engine, and this is the raw water pump. And if you ever need to change the impeller, all you have to do is take these 4 screws off, and the plate comes off, and you can pull the impeller out and put a replacement. Why would you need to change it? Well, if your water intake gets clogged by seaweed, by a plastic bag, it won't take the impeller long to disintegrate, and you'll lose all your cooling. And that happens periodically. So if you're cruising, definitely know where that spare impeller is. The water from the pump then goes back to the back of the engine to a heat exchanger, because this is this cooling system has a fresh water, which is antifreeze, 50% antifreeze, and then the raw water, which cools it in the heat exchanger. After the heat exchanger, the raw water goes over and gets injected into the exhaust, which goes into the aqua lift, which on Sorella is a big cylindrical tub, more rectangular on the Mark III and Island side. But this is an important item in that the water gets injected to, in a sense, cool the exhaust, but also gets then pumped out. A key element, and if you look on by the key on the main panel, is that if it says if you crank the engine for more than 30 seconds without the engine starting, you should drain the aqua lift. And on this boat, there is a nice drain on the bottom in the back under the sink, and I think we're looking at that right now. The reason is when the engine is cranking but not starting, the water is still pumping, but the exhaust is not pushing it out. And so it can literally back up all the way into the cylinder head, the exhaust manifold, and destroy an engine. So it's critical that if you crank the engine without it starting, to drain the aqua lift. And there's convenient drain plugs on those. So that's important. Let's talk now about the freshwater system, which there's a reservoir right here on top of the engine, but then we have a separate reservoir under the sink, which is, I guess you call it an excess reservoir. And that's the one you check to make sure you have adequate antifreeze mixture, 50-50 water antifreeze. You would never want to open the cap on the top of the engine unless you're doing a total refill, because it will spill out, drain the reservoir. So the antifreeze or freshwater system has its own internal pump. That's one that you cannot change without disassembling the engine. But what we have here, you see a couple of hoses, a couple of gauges here, or senders, one for the coolant temperature, one's an over temperature. But these hoses go off to the water heater, and which is located typically in the back over one of the lazarettes. That's how you get hot water on this. And then it goes to that heat exchanger we talked about before and recirculates. One thing I didn't mention is if the impeller, the raw water impeller ever implodes and turns into lots of small pieces, they will end up in the heat exchanger, and it's possible to take the ends of the heat exchanger off and clear out those pieces because they will eventually clog things up. Okay, now we're going to talk about the fuel system. And from the fuel tank, the diesel fuel comes over to a filter and a separator. And this is important because the separator, which is nice and pink, which is the color of the diesel, is also where any water would end up that would need to be drained from the fuel. Say you got some water in the main diesel tank. That's tricky to drain that, but there is a drain valve on the bottom, and what you have to be careful about is if you ever do drain that, to get the water out, to not let any air get back in. Water would show up as milky, and haven't had that problem recently, but occasionally people will fill up their diesel tank and surprise, surprise, there might be a little bit of water in it that came from the supplier. Anyway, that fuel line then comes around to a lift pump, and that lift pump is right over here, and that's an electric pump which makes a ticking sound. You can see an electrical connection going to it by that red wire. If the lift pump doesn't work at some point, it might be because that wire has become disconnected, and that's easily remedied. The lift pump then provides fuel through another filter, which is on the side of the engine down below. That's a fuel filter. That's also a point where you can bleed the fuel line. It then comes up to the high pressure pump. So this is the high pressure pump, which then has metal lines, because it's high pressure, that goes to the individual injectors. You see right next to those the glow plugs, which preheat the fuel. There's three, because this is a 3-cylinder. They're right next to the injectors, and those are fed by a wire that comes from a solenoid, because it's drawing lots of current, and this is then turned on when you turn the key to the glow plug and lift pump position prior to starting the engine. If you were ever to turn the keys on and nothing ever happens, one possibility is that a circuit breaker has popped, and that is a 20 amp breaker that's right on the back of the engine, and it is a button type breaker where the button is on the very back, and that feeds the DC power to the panel back in the cockpit. So that's one thing to check if you at some point do not have power, and you check to make sure your batteries are good and your Perco is turned on. We're going to first look at the shore power plug, and if you look over here, you'll see a blue light indicating there's actually power to the plug. The wire, and this is 30 amp, 125 volt. In the lazarette, just behind the plug, you will see the 30 amp master breaker. This sometimes will get tripped if you're taking something out of the stern lazarette, and so if you don't have power in the boat, that's one of the first places to look, and it's easy to reset that. So that happens frequently if people are taking out the stern anchor or some lines or life jackets or barbecue or whatever's stored back there. We're now looking at the electrical panel, and you can see on the left-hand side, it's listed as 120 volt AC service. So this square is the AC. Again, there's another 30 amp breaker that has to be on. The AC light, which is this little green light here, is very hard to see, but it's actually on. I think it shows on the camera. Below that, there's a couple of on-off switches. And for outlets and battery charger, they're in the in position, so they're on. You always want the outlets and battery charger on. But the water heater, and this is the electric water heater, we want off, unless you were staying on the boat in the slip and you wanted hot water, then you could turn it on. But otherwise, it just runs up our electric bill. An important light here is a red light just below the green AC on. If that is shining, it means that there's typically a connection or an electrical problem with the shore power, and it's not getting the proper polarities. Okay, on the right-hand side, we have the DC panel, and we can see in this case the DC master, typically called the Perco, is in the both position. Normally, this would have been off. In fact, I will go ahead and turn it off. So in the off position, both batteries are still getting charged, and in fact, we can test that by testing the batteries independently, and if they're above 12.7, in this case it's about 13.5 or so, it means the battery chargers are working. Likewise, if the engine was running, the alternator would have it up at about 14 volts. If you don't see that, it means, or if the voltage reads 12 or anywhere below that, it means the batteries haven't gotten charged, and you might not be able to start the engine. Okay. Typically, we've got two batteries, and we'll look at those in a second. The battery number 1 is listed as crank, so that's for starting the engine, and that will typically be a battery designed to provide a high current for short periods of time. The house battery, if we switch over to 2, is a slow discharge battery, so there are two different types of batteries typically on these boats. So the house you would use at anchor or to run systems when you're sailing. You always like to keep your crank battery for starting the engine and not draw it down by running the house system or the radar or some other high amperage systems. This is very important when you're cruising, less important for day sails. Okay, all the instruments are labeled, running lights, anchor lights, etc. Pretty straightforward, and there's really no need to go into any of those particular systems. I'll just point out a couple. One is there's an electric valve for the propane LP gas valve. This switch has to be on after you've opened the valve on the propane tank. You can see that there are some breakers built into the system in small groups, so if something doesn't work, it could be that breaker is popped. Let's look at the batteries now, because there's something unique on Sorella. The batteries are under the starboard berth, and we have them, and they're labeled. So these are pretty standard wet batteries. And we have battery 1, which is the cranking battery, battery 2, which is the house battery. What's unique on Sorella is that there are thermal breakers, and that is what these two units are. So if the battery were to have drawn excessive amount of current, it will potentially pop this breaker, which is a nice safety feature. That's on this particular boat. I don't believe we have it on any of the other boats. Okay. Let's see. Looking at this panel, you shouldn't really need to access the back of it. That's more of a boat chief function if something's not working. You have to be careful if you ever do access the back of that panel, especially if shore power is on, because means you have live exposed 120 volt cables back there. That should really only be opened if those are off. Okay, if the AC power, shore power is off. In the stern of Sorella, I'm going to access the propane tank, which is right here. You can see the tank, something that's well, let's open the valve, and you can see that the pressure jumped up to almost 120 psi. But there's something very important, and a lot of people have a misconception that the pressure will tell you how much is in the tank. Basically, with liquid propane, it will read the same pressure until it is totally out. So the best way to measure the amount of propane is to actually weigh the tank, lift it up. And I can feel this is quite heavy, so it's pretty much full. Some of the boats we have literally have scales, and the tank has an empty weight and a full weight, and so you can see how much is in it. I just do it by lifting it up. Okay, so we talked about the switch down on the electrical panel. This is the solenoid that is activated when that switch is on. So you won't get any propane until you turn on that electrical switch. And then it will go to the stovetop and oven. That's pretty much it. So it's always a good practice to turn off the propane when you're not using it, just in case there's any kind of a leak. We are in the main salon of Sorella, and we are going to find the macerator and talk about how to use it. So we're going to get the cushions out of here. So the head on the boat is right behind this panel, just forward of the main salon. And we'll now open these two compartments. And this is the holding tank that the head pumps into, and then down below, and in fact, let's actually get this out of here as well. The valve for the macerator is actually right next to the water intake. So this is the macerator outlet. You never want to make the mistake of opening this instead of the engine water, which is right next to it. But so the two ways of emptying the holding tank. One is to go to a pump out station, and then the other is to use the macerator, which is basically a high-speed DC engine that will chop up everything into nice fluid and pump it out. So it's a pump, but also it is chopping up everything. So to operate that, you want to be 3 miles off the coast, or in the case of a marine sanctuary, 6 miles off the islands. You would then open up the through hole, and then you would turn on the macerator. And we're not going to do that here since we're sitting in the harbor, and it's not appropriate to run that. But basically, the macerator will make a high-speed sound, high-speed engine sound when until it starts actually pumping, and then it goes to a much lower sound, a deeper sound. And when it's empty, now in this case you actually have a hose that you can put a light behind, and you can see the stuff being pumped out. It's important not to run the macerator for an excessive time without any fluid going through it, because it can burn out the DC motor. And then always make sure to close the macerator valve down here after you're done, because if you don't, you can fill the holding tank with seawater. It'll just backflow in. And that's happened recently on one of the other club boats. Okay, a couple other important things with the holding tank. There's a vent on top. We don't have any gauge to tell us how full this is, but this vent goes up to the side of the boat, and if the holding tank were to fill, you would have stuff coming out of the vent. So if you're going to go on a cruise, or even if you use it during the day, it's best to macerate or pump out so that the tank isn't full for the next person. We are looking in the bilge. We have the bilge pump, but instead of a float switch, which this boat used to have, it now has a water witch that actually will activate when the water level gets higher. The way to test that is to get some water on there, and then there's a little time delay, and we should have the pump starting, and there it goes. The nice thing about the water witch is it has a timer circuit, so it will stay on a little after the water level has dropped, so it actually gets pumped out rather than just cycling back and forth, which will happen sometimes because the water exit point is above the bilge. Okay, we are back at the DC panel, and the red light for the bilge pump, which we were just actuating, is still on. That should shut off momentarily. But what we're going to do is turn on the pressurized water system, and that switch is just above the bilge. And since we have been activating this recently, there was the pump did not actually turn on. So again, we have a pressurized water system, and as soon as we turn the water on, and we do have the drain open, the pump that pressurizes the water system is actuated as the pressure has dropped. And you can hear that it still continues to pressurize, which it should shut off momentarily. It's actually back behind the berth, which is hard to get to when there is an inflatable packed in there. But if you ever had a problem with the pressurized water system or leaks, then you would want to check that pump, which is again just behind the stairs in the stern berth. There are two tanks, water tanks, one up forward on this boat and one in the main salon. I can show that here. So there's the water tank, and it also has a vent, so when you're filling, well, not only will you get water at the fill, but it will also start coming out of the vent. So those two tanks are fed to that water pump, which then is spread out to both the sink in the main galley, into the head, which is up forward, and also to a shower on the stern of the boat. So if you've been out swimming, you can shower off with fresh water. Now, most sailors will not drink the fresh water, but it can be used for showering or cleaning. It's felt that it's best to have bottled water for actual drinking and cooking. There is a water heater. On Sorella, the water heater is under the aft berth, right behind the stairs in front of the fuel tank. And just off to the side is that water pressure pump. So another place to look for coolant leaks is at the, if you have a coolant leak into the bilge, it would be where it connects to the water heater. And it will heat the water either electrically if you're on shore power, or when the engine is running, the coolant, the freshwater coolant goes through the water heater and will heat any fresh water that's in there. So if you've just been motoring and you use you can get hot water, or if you really want a warm shower, you have to turn on the engine for a little while. Okay, so in the galley we have our refrigerator, and it is basically an ice box, but it also has a cold plate, and there's a adjustable thermostat for the cold plate, and there's a compressor in the lazarette, the port lazarette in the cockpit. It's best, that does use a fair amount of current, so it's best to run that. Well, one thing you can do is turn it on the night before, and it will chill down overnight. The alternative is to use the compressor when the engine's running, so you don't run down your house battery. And it will help chill. I think most of us still bring blocks of ice, and in some cases even a separate ice chest for keeping beverages. Otherwise it gets a little crowded in the ice box.